the dog wouldn't leave. That was the first thing Marcus Webb noticed when he pulled his truck off the county road and onto the overgrown gravel drive that wound through 200 yards of briar and cedar scrub before opening onto his grandmother's property. He had barely cut the engine before Ranger was pressed against the passenger window, not barking, not whining, just staring, fixed and motionless in a way that Marcus had only seen once before, in a courtyard in eastern Afghanistan, 3 seconds before the world came apart. Marcus sat with his hand still on the wheel and looked where the dog was looking. The smokehouse. It sat 40 feet beyond the main structure, half swallowed by a persimmon thicket that had gone wild across the back edge of the property over the past 5 decades. The building was small, maybe 8 feet square, maybe less, constructed from the same weathered chestnut logs as the farmhouse, its roof heavy with moss, and its single iron-strapped door sealed with a loop of baling wire twisted through the latch and a padlock the color of old blood. The wire had been there so long it had pressed grooves into the wood. The padlock had fused shut with rust. Nothing had opened that door in a very long time. Nothing had tried. Ranger made a sound low in his chest. Not a growl. Something quieter than a growl. Something Marcus had no name for. "Easy," Marcus said. His voice was flat. It was always flat these days. He climbed out of the truck and felt the cold of the Tennessee hills settle onto his shoulders like a hand pressing down. The October air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere farther along the ridge, and underneath that, something older. The specific sweetness of a property that had not been tended in years, of land that had been given back to itself. He stood beside the truck and took it in. The farmhouse needed work. The porch boards had sprung at the nails, 2 windows were cracked, and the chimney leaned slightly east in a way that suggested the mortar had given up somewhere in the last decade. The barn behind it had lost half its roof to a tree that had fallen and never been moved. The garden his grandmother had kept for 60 years was a rectangle of weeds, bounded by stones she had placed herself, 1 season at a time, until she could no longer kneel. She had been gone 11 days. And in those 11 days, Marcus had been served with an eviction notice from his apartment in Nashville, a certified letter from his Uncle Roy's attorney informing him that the estate was being contested, and a call from his ex-wife's lawyer that he had not returned. He had loaded what fit in the truck: clothes, tools, a box of documents, Ranger's gear, and driven 3 hours east on I-40, and then another 40 minutes south into the hills until the GPS lost interest and the road narrowed to the width of 2 vehicles that did not quite trust each other. He had nowhere else to go. He had known that before he left Nashville. He had not said it out loud because saying it would have made it a different kind of thing. Ranger had jumped from the truck without waiting and was now standing at the edge of the persimmon thicket, nose pressed to a gap at the base of the smokehouse door, his entire body still except for his nostrils. "Ranger." The dog did not look up. "Ranger. Come." The shepherd turned his head, regarded Marcus with those pale amber eyes that had seen things no training manual accounted for, and then turned back to the door. Marcus exhaled through his nose. He had learned, over the 8 years since he and Ranger had been assigned to the same unit, that the dog's refusals were not defiance. They were information. The challenge was in knowing what kind. He crossed the yard slowly, his boots pulling in the soft ground where the grass had died back and the earth was still damp from 2 days of rain. He crouched beside Ranger and rested his palm on the dog's back. feeling the faint vibration that lived in Ranger's spine when something had his full attention. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Not commanding, just asking. Ranger's nose worked along the gap at the door's base, slow and methodical. Then he sat. Then he looked at Marcus again, and this time he held the look. Marcus pressed his own face closer to the door. He could smell it faintly, beneath the rot of the wood and the mineral sweetness of the iron hardware. Something else. Something he could not place. Something dry and complex, like old paper and cured wood, and something else underneath. Something his brain cataloged and then set aside because it had no category for it. He stood and looked at the padlock. Then he looked at Ranger. Then he went to the truck for a bolt cutter. If this story is already pulling you in, I'm gonna go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world to this channel. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Marcus Webb was 42 years old. He had spent 14 years in the United States Navy, the last 9 of those as a SEAL, and he wore the years the way a working tool wears its use. Not as damage exactly, but as evidence. There was a scar that ran from his left temple to the edge of his jaw, thin and white, from a piece of copper wire that had found him in a compound outside Kandahar. There was a stiffness in his right hip that arrived every morning before anything else did, when a souvenir from the blast that had ended his career and left Ranger with a notch in his left ear and a slight unevenness in his gait that only showed when the weather dropped below 40 degrees. He did not talk about what happened in that compound. He had said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it, and then he had closed that particular door and left it that way. Some doors you sealed and did not open. He understood that. He had done it himself. What he had not been prepared for was everything that came after. The transition from a life defined by mission and team and purpose into a life in which every morning began with the same question. What is this day for? He had tried 3 jobs in 2 years. He had tried a marriage that had lasted 4 years and dissolved quietly, without cruelty, but also without surprise, the both of them having arrived at the same silent conclusion from different directions. He had tried the VA counseling, had sat in the plastic chair and answered the questions honestly, and then driven home, feeling like a man who had correctly identified a problem he still could not fix. What had helped, the only thing that had ever consistently helped, was Ranger. The dog had been retired from service 6 months after Marcus was medically separated. His handler had died in a vehicle accident in Germany, not in combat, not in some way that made narrative sense, but in an ordinary, terrible accident on an autobahn. And Ranger had spent 3 weeks in a kennel facility before Marcus drove to the installation and signed the paperwork that no one in the adoption office seemed surprised to receive. They had known each other for 4 years by then. They had worked together in 4 countries. The dog already slept in Marcus's patterns, woke when Marcus woke, tensed when Marcus tensed, and pressed his body against Marcus's leg in the specific way he now pressed it when a nightmare came. They had built a life together in the Nashville apartment, a small life, but a deliberate one. Marcus did freelance security consulting work that paid enough and required enough concentration to keep the quieter hours from growing too heavy. Ranger kept his own schedule, morning patrol of the apartment's perimeter, mid-afternoon nap in the window where the light came through best, evening watch from the threshold while Marcus cooked And Marcus had come to understand that this schedule was not habit, but vocation. Ranger was still working, and he would always be working. The work had just changed, and then the eviction notice, which was not entirely unexpected. The building had been sold. The new owners had plans. Marcus had 30 days, and he had not argued because argument required a destination, and he had not had one until his grandmother died and left him the property in the hills that no one else in the family had wanted. Not for years. Not until Roy's lawyer sent the letter suggesting the will had irregularities that warranted examination. The will had no irregularities. Marcus had read it 3 times. His grandmother had been precise, even at the end, and she had written her intentions in the same clear hand she used for recipes and prayer lists. The land, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, and everything on the property passed to her grandson, Marcus Allen Webb, upon her death. She had been specific about the outbuildings. She had been specific enough that Marcus had noticed it, the way you notice when someone is careful about a thing they do not need to explain, including the smokehouse. She had written, "The smokehouse and its entire contents, sealed as they are, to pass undisturbed to Marcus." Undisturbed. He had read that word several times as well. The bolt cutter went through the shackle of the padlock on the 3rd attempt. The lock had been quality iron once, not the cheap alloy of modern hardware, but the dense, close-grained metal of something made before efficiency replaced craft. And even 50 years of Tennessee weather had not entirely surrendered it. But the bolt cutter won eventually. Then when the padlock fell into Marcus's hand, and he held it for a moment, feeling its weight, before setting it on the ground, beside Ranger. The dog was sitting exactly as he had been, watching. Marcus worked the baling wire free from the latch with his gloved hands, unwinding it carefully because the wire had grown into the wood slightly, the way a vine grows into a fence, and pulling it wrong would take splinters from the door that were part of its integrity. When the wire came free, he coiled it and set it aside. He put his hand on the iron latch. He did not open it immediately. He was not sure why he hesitated. It was his door now, his property, his inheritance. What little of it remained, after Roy's lawyers and the estate taxes and the general attrition that follows a death. He had every right. His grandmother had written it plainly. And yet there was something in the quality of Ranger's attention, the held-breath stillness of a dog who had learned to read the space before a moment changed, that made Marcus stop for just a few seconds and feel the weight of what he was about to do. Sealed since 1973. His grandmother had been born in 1929. She had married his grandfather, Emmett Webb, in 1951. Emmett had gone to Korea, come home, built this farmhouse with his own hands over the course of 3 years, sunk the well, cleared the acreage, and then gone to Vietnam as an advisor in 1968, a decision that had puzzled the family at the time and was never fully explained. He had been killed outside Da Nang in March of 1973, 2 months before the last American combat troops came home. Marcus had never met him, and he existed only in photographs and the stories his grandmother told in the particular way people told stories about the irreplaceable lost, carefully, with spaces between the words where the grief still lived. The smokehouse predated the farmhouse. Emmett had not built it. It had been on the property when his grandmother bought the land in 1949, a structure from some earlier settlement, and Emmett had used it the way a working farm used a smokehouse, for meat in the fall, for curing, for storage when nothing else was available. And then, at some point after his death, his grandmother had sealed it, wrapped it in wire, put a lock on it, and kept it sealed for 51 years. She had never told Marcus why. She had told him it existed. She had told him it was his. She had told him once, sitting on the porch in the blue light of a summer evening when Marcus was 17 years old and asking questions she did not always answer, that some things were better left until the time for them arrived. He had been 24 the next time he thought to ask, and by then he was in Coronado running through the surf and the sand with people he would trust with his life, and the Smokehouse and the question it represented had moved to the back of the drawer where deferred things lived. He was 42 now. He lifted the latch. The door opened inward with a sound that was not quite a creak and not quite a groan, something between the two, a sound of compression releasing, of air that had been held for a very long time beginning to move. A breath came out of the Smokehouse that Marcus felt on his face before he smelled it, cold and dry and dense, with something that took his memory a second to locate and then placed precisely, the smell of cured hickory wood and rendered fat, and underneath those things, beneath everything else, the dry, papery smell of documents kept in an enclosed space for decades. Ranger pressed past his leg and entered the Smokehouse before Marcus did. He stood on the threshold and let his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Light came in only from the door and from two small gaps in the chinking between the logs on the east wall, where decades of weather had worked the mortar loose. The floor was hard-packed earth. The ceiling was low enough that Marcus had to duck slightly. Iron hooks hung from the rafters. The original smoking hardware, on still solid, and along the far wall, a single wooden shelf had been installed at waist height, running the full width of the building. On the shelf sat a metal trunk. Not large, roughly the size of a steamer chest, military green, secured with two clasps and a padlock that was identical in style to the one that had been on the door. Military issue. Marcus recognized the model. He had seen them in old photographs. Korea era, possibly earlier. Ranger sat in front of it and looked at Marcus. Marcus crossed the small space in 4 steps. He crouched in front of the trunk and looked at it the way he looked at things that required assessment before action. Completely, without hurry, letting his eyes move over every surface. The metal was pitted in places, but not corroded through. The clasps were stiff, so the padlock was a smaller version of the one from the door, and it had fared better in the enclosed space. The shackle was discolored, but not fused. He reached into his jacket pocket for the key he had found in his grandmother's house. He had not known what had opened. He had found it 3 days after she died, in the ceramic dish on the windowsill of her bedroom, where she kept the things she touched every day. A rosary, a folded prayer card, 2 quarters, and a small key on a length of worn ribbon. He had put it in his pocket without knowing why. He had not been able to explain the impulse. He had simply felt that the key was meant for him. He held it now against the padlock. It fit. The lock opened. Ranger made the sound again, the one without a name. Marcus set the padlock beside the trunk and lifted the clasps. They moved with resistance, but not impossibility. The resistance of 50 years of disuse rather than damage. He lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged and wrapped in brown paper that had gone the color of old honey, were documents, letters, photographs, several small objects wrapped separately, a military citation in a frame, and on top of everything, written in his grandmother's handwriting on a piece of paper that had been folded in thirds and placed where it would be seen immediately. A single line. For Marcus, when the time comes, you will know what to do with all of it. I could not bear to. He did not open anything that first afternoon, for he carried the trunk to the farmhouse and set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a long time, while Ranger settled at his feet and the light changed outside, and the sound of a truck on the county road came and went. He made coffee on the camp stove he had brought from Nashville, because the farmhouse had no utilities yet, and would not until he made the calls that needed to be made. He drank the coffee standing at the window that looked out toward the smokehouse, toward the persimmon thicket, and the open door, and the empty shelf inside. He had the feeling, which he did not fully trust, and did not fully dismiss, that he had been expected here, that the property had been waiting for him with a specific kind of patience that only old land manages. That Ranger had known something the moment they pulled off the county road. Wyatt had pressed his nose to the door of the smokehouse with the certainty of a dog who has caught a scent that belongs to his person, and that what was in the trunk was going to change the shape of things in ways Marcus could not yet see. He was still standing at the window when he heard the truck slow on the county road. It did not stop. It slowed, the engine dropping in pitch, and in the gray October light, Marcus could see the shape of a newer pickup idling along the road below the drive, the driver's window cracked despite the cold. He watched without moving, the way he watched things that had not yet declared their intentions. Ranger lifted his head from the floor, but did not stand. The truck moved on. But it moved on slowly. The first person to come up the drive came the next morning, before Marcus had finished clearing the main room of the farmhouse, enough to sleep in it. He was a large man, somewhere in his early 60s, in canvas work clothes and a hat that had been worn past the point of shape. He drove a truck that Marcus recognized as a neighbor's truck, the way you recognize such things in hill country, by the specific combination of color and dent and aftermarket addition that makes every working vehicle its own biography. The man parked at the bottom of the drive and walked up without hesitation, which Marcus noted as information. "Earl Sutton," the man said, extending his hand. "Property south of yours along the creek." Marcus Webb. Earl's eyes moved across the farmhouse, the barn, the cleared ground, and then settled briefly on the smokehouse door, still standing open, before returning to Marcus. "Heard you come in. Sound carries up here in the fall." He paused. "Sorry about your grandmother. Vera was a good woman. She was here before any of the rest of us." She was. Ranger had come around the corner of the farmhouse and now stood beside Marcus without touching him, the professional position Earl noticed, glancing at the dog with the mild wariness of a man who had been around working dogs enough to know what one looked like. "Military?" Earl asked, nodding at Ranger. 8 years. Retired. Yours now? Mine now." Earl considered this, then nodded in the specific way that meant he had integrated the information and moved past it. "You planning to stay on?" "That's the plan." Something shifted in Earl's expression. Not quite relief, not quite approval, but something in the vicinity of both. "So Roy's been up here twice in the last month," he said. And he said it the way people said things they had been holding for someone to say them to. "I assume you know about Roy." "I know about Roy. He brought a man in a suit the second time. They walked around the property." Earl looked at Marcus directly, walked around the smokehouse, tried the door. Marcus felt something in his chest tighten and then release, the way a hand grips, and let's go. The door was locked. It was, Earl said. Roy didn't seem to think that would be permanent. Marcus looked out toward the smokehouse. The open door was visible from where they stood, the interior dim, and the shelf clearly empty. He had brought the trunk inside the night before. He had made sure of that. Roy's welcome to look, Marcus said. He won't find anything that belongs to him. Earl studied him for a moment. Then, for the first time, something that might have been a smile moved across the older man's face. Brief and dry. The smile of a man who had watched a lot of things unfold on this ridge and had learned to tell the difference between a situation going one way and a situation going another. Vera always said you'd come back, Earl said. He looked at Ranger. The dog looked back at him, calm and steady. Said she'd kept it for you. The property. Earl did not answer immediately. He looked at the smokehouse again. Then he looked at Marcus. You need anything, he said. I'm down along the creek. You'll hear my dogs before you see my truck. He extended his hand again. Marcus shook it. Earl walked back to his truck without looking back. Marcus watched him go and thought about what the man had said, and thought about the trunk on the kitchen table, and thought about Ranger standing at the smokehouse door the afternoon before, with his nose pressed to the gap, as though the smell coming through the wood was something he recognized. He went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. He began to open the letters. They were numbered on the outside of each envelope in his grandmother's handwriting, not dated, numbered, as if she had always intended them to be read, in order by someone who would not know the order otherwise. 43 envelopes. The postmarks on the ones with postmarks began in 1968 and ended in February of 1973, a month before Emmett Webb was killed. The later ones had no postmarks. They had been written and sealed and never mailed. So Marcus picked up envelope number 1 and held it without opening it. It was addressed to his grandmother at this address, in handwriting he had never seen before. A man's handwriting, angular and deliberate. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write in a time when penmanship was still treated as a form of discipline. His grandfather's handwriting. Ranger put his head on Marcus's knee. All right, Marcus said quietly. He did not know who he was talking to. He opened the envelope. Outside, down along the county road, a car slowed. Marcus heard it distantly, the way you hear things you have not yet decided to pay attention to. A different car from Earl Sutton's truck. Smaller engine, quieter. The sound of something that had been driven a long distance and was arriving with purpose rather than proximity. And he looked up from the letter. Through the cracked window he could see the road, barely, through the gap in the cedar thicket. A sedan, out-of-county plates. Ranger had lifted his head. Roy's lawyer worked out of Knoxville. Marcus set the letter down on the table face up, the words visible, his grandfather's handwriting open to the air for the first time in 50 years, and looked at it for a moment before looking back toward the road. He had served 4 combat deployments. He had learned to distinguish between the urgency that required immediate action and the urgency that required patience, and he had learned that the second kind was almost always harder. The sedan on the road below was the second kind. The letter on the table was the first. He picked the letter back up. Ranger settled his head back onto Marcus's knee. The sedan moved on down the road, slowly. Marcus read. His grandfather had been precise in ways that Marcus recognized and that felt, reading across 50 years of silence, like a kind of kinship. Emmett Webb had not been a man who used more words than a thing required, and the first letter, written in October of 1968, 3 days after he arrived in Vietnam, said what needed saying in 2 pages that managed to contain both the logistical and the emotional without making a production of either. He wrote about the country. He wrote about the heat and the smell and the quality of the light, which he described as unlike any light he had seen anywhere. Heavy and green and ancient feeling, as though the air itself remembered things that had happened there longer ago than any living person could account for. He wrote about the other men. He wrote about missing the property, specifically and in detail. The way the morning came over the East Ridge in October, the sound of the creek in the lower pasture after rain, the particular smell of the smokehouse in curing season. And at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that was slightly smaller than the rest, as though he had needed to compress something in order to finish the letter, before a deadline he had not explained. I have left something for you, Vera. Not just what you already know about. Something I should have told you years ago and did not, because I did not know how to make it make sense without the papers to go with it. The papers are in the box. If something happens to me before I can come home and explain it myself, open the box. The boy, when there is a boy, he should know, as it belongs to him the way this land belongs to him. I am sorry I waited so long to do what should have been done before I left. Marcus read this paragraph 3 times. Then he looked at the trunk. Then he looked at Ranger. "What did he leave?" he said, not expecting an answer. Just saying the words because sometimes saying words is the only way to make a thing real. Ranger thumped his tail once on the floor. Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge, moving through the cedars with a sound like old water. The farmhouse settled around them, the sound of boards adjusting to the cold, of a structure that had been waiting a long time for someone to come back and give it weight and heat and purpose again. Marcus reached into the trunk. He found the papers his grandfather had mentioned in a separate sleeve of oilcloth at the bottom of the trunk, beneath the letters and the photographs and the military citation. The oilcloth was sealed with wax along the seam, country wax, the old kind, pressed into the fold with a thumb. It had held. 50 years in the dry interior of the smokehouse, and it had held. He did not open the oilcloth sleeve. Not yet. He held it and felt the thickness of what was inside. Documents, several of them, stiff with age, and set it carefully on the table beside the letters. He was going to need to know what was in those letters before he opened the sleeve. He was going to need the full context, the way a man needs to understand the whole of a landscape before he can locate himself within it, correctly. He started with letter number 2, so by the time darkness came down the ridge and settled over the property, Marcus had read through letter number 9. He had lit a lantern he found in the barn, hurricane glass, still with oil in it, which was the kind of detail that made him feel his grandmother's presence in the room with him in a way that was not unpleasant. And in its light, the kitchen table looked like the kind of table where important things were decided. He had the outline of it now. Not the whole of it, but the outline. His grandfather had come to Vietnam not entirely for the reasons he had told his family. There was something else. Something that had to do with a piece of land. Not this land, but land adjacent to this land. Land that had been in the Webb family before Emmett's father lost it in a legal maneuver in 1947 that Emmett had spent the following 20 years quietly unraveling. He had found something in the county records. He had found a document that the county should not have been able to record the way it had been recorded. He had spent his own money having it examined by a lawyer in Knoxville. Not Roy's lawyer. Not anyone Roy would ever have known. And the lawyer had told him he had a case. But making the case required a document that the county had, and Emmett had believed the only way to get the county to produce it was through a formal legal challenge. He had been preparing for that challenge when he shipped out. He had left the materials, the case files, the original document copies, the lawyer's assessment, and something else that Marcus had not yet reached in the letters, in the trunk, in the smokehouse, sealed, waiting for his grandson. Ranger sighed and shifted at Marcus's feet. The lantern made the shadows move in the old room. Outside, a whippoorwill called from the cedar thicket, and the sound was so specifically the sound of this place, the sound Marcus associated with his grandmother and childhood visits and the specific quality of Tennessee night, that it felt less like a bird and more like the property speaking. Marcus looked at the oilcloth sleeve on the table. He looked at the pile of letters he had not yet read. He looked at Ranger. "Long day," he said. The dog's tail moved once. "Longer tomorrow." He did not know yet what was in the oilcloth sleeve, and he did not know yet what his grandfather had been reaching toward in those letters, what specific document or legal claim or buried truth he had been assembling across 5 years of correspondence from the other side of the world, while his wife kept his smokehouse sealed and his land changed hands in ways he had already begun to contest. He did not know yet what Roy knew or how much or why the sedan with the Knoxville plates had slowed on the county road twice in one afternoon. He did not know yet why Ranger, a dog who had worked bomb detection in 4 countries, who had a nose calibrated to find things other creatures could not find, who had pressed his face to the smokehouse door and refused to move, had sat in front of that trunk with the look of an animal who recognized something he had been waiting to recognize, but he was going to find out. He folded letter number 9 along its original crease and set it with the others. He put the lantern on the counter, where it threw light across the room in a way that made the farmhouse feel inhabited, in a way it had not felt in years. He pulled a blanket from his pack and settled into the old chair by the window. Not the bed. Not yet. The chair first. The chair where he could watch the property and the road. And Ranger climbed up beside him with the old man's careful deliberateness of a dog whose joints remembered cold weather. They sat together in the yellow lantern light while the October night settled over the ridge and the cedar thicket moved in the wind and the smokehouse door stood open with its empty shelf and its 51 years of held breath finally released into the country air. Now Marcus put his hand on Ranger's back. The dog was warm and real and present. The papers on the table were real. The letters were real. Whatever his grandfather had hidden in this place for half a century, whatever claim or truth or reckoning he had packed into that trunk and sealed away and addressed, in some sense, to a grandson who had not yet been born when the letter was written, was real. And somewhere down the ridge, Roy's lawyer would make another call in the morning, and the probate court had a hearing scheduled for 30 days from now. And the land that adjoined this property, the land that Emmett Webb had been quietly building a case to reclaim when a road outside Da Nang ended everything, was currently held by a development company that had been making inquiries about the creek access, about the watershed, or about what it would take to bring utilities up the ridge. Marcus looked out the window at the dark shape of the smokehouse against the slightly lighter dark of the October sky. His grandmother had sealed it in 1973 and kept it sealed for 51 years. She had left it to him specifically, and with specific language. She had written on a piece of paper that she had placed on top of everything. I could not bear to. She had kept it. She had protected it. She had waited for the time to be right, which she must have understood would not be her time, but his. He had never understood until this moment, sitting in a farmhouse with no power and no heat, and a dog pressed against his side, and a trunk full of his grandfather's careful, urgent, half-finished work on the kitchen table, what it meant to inherit something, when he had thought it meant property, acreage, a building that needed work. He understood now that it meant something considerably larger and considerably more complicated, and that whatever was in the oilcloth sleeve at the bottom of that trunk, whatever legal instrument or documentation or evidence his grandfather had been racing to assemble before the spring of 1973 caught up with him, it was the reason his grandmother had sealed the smokehouse and kept it sealed. It was the reason she had written undisturbed. It was the reason Ranger had pressed his face to the gap at the base of the door and refused to leave. Marcus closed his eyes. The whippoorwill called again from the thicket. Tomorrow he would read the rest of the letters. Tomorrow he would open the oilcloth sleeve. Tomorrow Earl Sutton might come down along the creek again, or Roy's lawyer might turn up the drive in the Knoxville sedan, or both, or neither, and Marcus would deal with whatever arrived with the specific kind of patience he had learned, the hard way, the only way it was ever really learned, that patience was not passivity, but its own form of preparation. But tonight he let the lantern burn and the farmhouse settle, and Ranger breathe against his side, with the slow, grounding certainty of a creature who had made his assessment and found the situation manageable. Tonight he let the letters lie on the table in the light and said nothing more, because some things did not need words to make them real. They were already real. The land was already his. He just had to prove it. He read through the night. Not all of the letters. There were too many for that, and some required a careful second reading before their meaning fully resolved, but enough. By the time the East Ridge went from black to gray to the pale, reluctant gold of an October sunrise, Marcus had read 26 of the 43 envelopes and had a shape of things clear enough to work with. His grandfather had been a methodical man. The letters did not tell their story in a single place or a single way. They told it the way a surveyor maps uncertain ground, in passes, each one confirming what the last had measured, each one adding detail until the whole picture emerged with enough precision to be trusted. You had to read all of them, or most of them, before any one of them made complete sense. Marcus understood. He was sitting in the thinning dark of the farmhouse kitchen, with Ranger's weight pressed against his leg and the lantern burning lower, that this was deliberate. His grandfather had known these letters might be read by someone other than their intended recipient. He had built them so that the whole only revealed itself when you held all the pieces at once. The shape of it was this. In 1946, Emmett Webb's father, Marcus's great-grandfather, Thomas Webb, had owned not 12 acres, but 31. The 12 that remained, and that Marcus had now inherited, were the parcel centered on the farmhouse and the creek's upper bend. The other 19 acres ran south and east along the creek bottom, rich bottomland that flooded in spring and dried into the best growing soil in the county, so land that Thomas Webb had farmed for 20 years and that Emmett Webb had grown up working. In 1947, while Thomas was recovering from a stroke that had taken his speech and most of his mobility, a deed had been recorded with the county that showed he had sold those 19 acres for $800 to a man named Curtis Alderman, who was at the time a county commissioner. Thomas Webb had never signed that deed. His wife, Emmett's mother, had never signed it either. They had been told, when they asked, that the documents were in order, that there was nothing to be done, that the county's records were the county's records. Alderman had sold the land 3 years later to a timber company. The timber company had logged it, sold it again, and the deed had passed through 5 more hands over 60 years until it landed, 18 months ago, in the portfolio of a Knoxville-based development company called Bridger Creek Holdings, LLC. Bridger Creek Holdings was seeking permits to build a high-end fishing lodge and private resort on the creek bottom, with plans for a road that would need to cross the remaining Webb property for access, which was why they had been making inquiries about easements, and why Roy had been making inquiries about the will. Roy Webb was a minority investor in Bridger Creek Holdings. Marcus found this in letter number 22. Not stated directly, his grandfather had not known Roy would grow up to be the kind of man who invested in development companies, because Roy had been 6 years old in 1968, but stated in the way that retroactively made the present circumstances make complete sense, the way a single line of a map can reorient your entire understanding of the terrain you thought you knew. The land will be worth something someday, his grandfather had written. The creek bottom always was. Whoever ends up with it when the county finally stops protecting Alderman's name will have something worth protecting. Make sure it's us, Vera. Find a way to make sure it's us. Vera had not found a way. She had been a woman in her 40s in rural Tennessee in the 1970s, with no money for lawyers and no standing in the county records office, and a husband who was the only person who had done the work of understanding what had been taken and how. And that husband was dead in the ground in Da Nang, and she had sealed his work in a box and a smokehouse and kept it for the boy who would come when the time was right. The time was now. Marcus folded letter 22 and set it on the stack with the others. He looked at the oilcloth sleeve on the table. He cut the wax seal with his pocket knife. He unfolded the oilcloth carefully because it was still supple. The waxy cloth had done its work for 50 years, and he did not want to crack it, and spread it on the table. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a photocopy, old, done on some machine from the early 1960s that rendered everything in purple ink, of the original 1931 survey of the Thomas Webb property. All 31 acres, clearly bounded, with the creek and the ridge as natural markers. The surveyor's signature at the bottom was legible. The second was a handwritten affidavit, dated 1965, signed by a woman named Luella Gaines, who stated that she had been present in the county records office on the day the disputed deed was filed, and had witnessed Curtis Alderman hand the document to the clerk himself. She stated that she had known Thomas Webb, and that he had been bedridden at the time and unable to travel. She stated that she was prepared to testify to these facts in any proceeding that required it. The third document was a letter from a Knoxville attorney named Samuel Hurst, dated 1967, addressed to Emmett Webb, informing him that based on the evidence provided, there was a viable case for deed fraud, and that the statute of limitations had not expired, and that the surviving family of Thomas Webb had standing to challenge the 1947 conveyance. The letter detailed what additional documentation would strengthen the case and what the likely timeline and cost of proceedings would be. The fourth document was a single sheet of paper in Emmett's handwriting, undated, that appeared to be a list. At the top, he had written, "What is still needed?" And below that, in his careful hand, 3 items. 2 of them were crossed out, indicating he had obtained them. The third was not crossed out. The original deed. The actual document, not the county's copy. Alderman kept it. Find where it went when he died. Marcus looked at this for a long time. Curtis Alderman had died in 1969. His grandfather had known this. The county death records were public, but had not yet found where the original deed had gone. He had shipped out to Vietnam without finding it. He had died without finding it. Marcus put his hand flat on the table beside the documents. Ranger raised his head and looked at him. "I know," Marcus said. He looked at the floor of the farmhouse kitchen. Old wood, wide planks, laid when the house was built by a man who had understood that the floor of a house was the foundation of everything that happened in it. Then he thought about Emmett Webb's smokehouse and the earthen floor he had walked across when he'd gone inside to find the trunk, and the iron hooks hanging from the rafters that had not been used in 50 years, and the shelf that had held only the trunk. And then he thought about something he had noticed without noting at the time, a flat stone near the far corner of the smokehouse floor, slightly different from the surrounding earth, as though it had been placed rather than occurring naturally. He picked up the lantern. Ranger was already at the door. The stone was 3 inches thick and roughly square, and it took Marcus 4 minutes to work it loose from the packed earth, with the flat of his pocket-knife blade along the seam. Ranger sat at his back, pressed against his spine, and did not move. The air in the smokehouse smelled different in daylight, more specific, more layered, and Marcus worked in silence except for his breath and the sound of the knife finding purchase. The stone lifted. Beneath it was a tin box, smaller than a cigar box, sealed around the lid with the same wax his grandfather had used on the oilcloth. Emmett Webb had spent money on wax. He had understood that what he was sealing needed to outlast uncertainty. Marcus did not open it in the smokehouse. He carried it to the kitchen table and set it beside the other documents, and sat down and looked at it for a moment, without touching it. Ranger sat beside his chair. The morning light was coming fully through the east window now, falling across the table in a rectangle that caught the tin box and the papers and the stack of letters, and made the whole collection look, briefly, like the kind of thing you would find in a museum. Evidence of a life that had been directed toward a single careful purpose. Marcus cut the wax and opened the lid. Inside, folded once along its width, was a document. Heavier paper than modern instruments, the stock used in county records in the 1940s. Rag paper, dense and slightly yellowed at the edges, but structurally sound. He unfolded it with the particular care of a man handling something irreplaceable. It was the original 1947 deed, the one that showed Thomas Webb's purported signature, the one that had transferred 19 acres of creek bottom to Curtis Alderman for $800 and had started everything. And across the bottom third of the document, in ink that had gone brown with age, but remained entirely legible, was a handwritten notation. Not Emmett's handwriting. Someone else's, cramped, hasty. The writing of a man recording something quickly because he expected to come back to it later, and never did. T. Webb did not sign. C.A. October 14th, 47. Curtis Alderman's own notation, on his own fraudulent deed, an admission written in his hand on the document itself. Marcus read it twice. He set it down on the table. So he put both hands flat on the wood and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at Ranger and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. His grandfather had died looking for this. Vera Webb had kept a smokehouse sealed for 51 years, protecting the case her husband had built, up to the point where only this one piece remained. And Curtis Alderman, the county commissioner, who had stolen 19 acres of creek bottom from a bedridden man in 1947, had written his own confession on the document in the same moment, probably because men who believed they held all the power often did not think carefully about the trail they left. The tin had gone from Alderman's estate to somewhere, probably a box in a house. It probably passed along with the kind of old papers that families kept without knowing what they contained, and Emmett had been tracking it when Vietnam stopped him. And now it was here, on this table, in the morning light. Marcus looked at the front door of the farmhouse. Through the window beside it, he could see the county road below the drive. A Knoxville sedan was pulling off the road. The lawyer's name was Delaney. He introduced himself as Preston Delaney, of Hearst and Delaney in Knoxville, and Marcus noted that the firm name matched the letter in the oilcloth sleeve. Samuel Hearst had been the attorney who wrote to Emmett in 1967, and 57 years later, his name was still on the door, or on the letterhead anyway, which meant the firm had survived and grown in the way that firms grow when they represent the right clients. Marcus did not say any of this. He stood on the farmhouse porch with Ranger at his left knee and watched Preston Delaney come up the drive in a coat that cost more than Marcus's truck payment, and shoes that would not last 20 minutes in the mud he was navigating with considerable care. "Mr. Webb." Delaney stopped at the base of the porch steps. He was in his late 40s, a lean man with the kind of careful pleasantness that Marcus associated with people who negotiated for a living. "I represent your uncle, Roy Webb, in the matter of the estate of Vera Agnes Webb, deceased. I apologize for not calling ahead. I tried the number on file, but it appears to be out of service." "It is," Marcus said. Delaney produced a business card and held it up. Marcus did not move to take it, and after a moment, Delaney set it on the porch railing. Our ranger's eyes tracked the card without moving his head. "I'll be direct, Mr. Webb, since I imagine you're a direct man. My client has concerns about the validity of the will as filed, particularly regarding the specific language pertaining to certain outbuildings on the property." He paused. "We are also concerned about the condition of the estate and whether adequate maintenance is being or can be performed by," he chose his word with visible care, "by a single occupant." "The property is mine," Marcus said. "The will is clear. Your client can file whatever motion he likes, and the court will read what my grandmother wrote." Delaney nodded, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. "We also represent Bridger Creek Holdings in their ongoing discussions about the creek bottom access easement. I want to be transparent about that. I know who Roy is invested with." Something shifted in Delaney's expression. Not much, but enough. He had not expected Marcus to know that. He recalibrated quickly, the way skilled lawyers recalibrated, smoothly and without appearing to. Then you understand that there are significant development interests involved that extend beyond the family dispute. A negotiated resolution would benefit everyone. "What kind of resolution?" "Bridger is prepared to make an offer for the property at current assessed value plus 15%, which I can tell you is above market for a structure in this condition." He gestured at the farmhouse with a brief, encompassing motion that managed to convey a great deal about what he thought of its condition without being explicitly rude. "My client would receive his share of the estate proceeds. You would receive a clean settlement, and the development project would proceed on a timeline that works for everyone." Marcus looked at him for long enough that Delaney became slightly uncertain of what was happening. "No," Marcus said. Delaney absorbed this. "Mr. Webb, I'd encourage you to think carefully. The probate hearing is in 3 weeks. If the will is successfully challenged, the estate would likely be sold by the court to satisfy the dispute, which means you'd receive considerably less. The will won't be successfully challenged. I understand you feel strongly. I have the original 1947 deed to the creek bottom acreage," Marcus said. "The 19 acres south and east of this property. The deed that shows the transfer to Curtis Alderman was fraudulent. I have the deed with Alderman's own notation on it, admitting the signature was not my great-grandfather's." He said this the way he said most things, without emphasis, without drama, in the flat, declarative tone that people who had spent time in situations where clarity mattered more than performance learned without being taught. "I also have a signed affidavit from a witness, a 1967 attorney's assessment confirming the validity of a fraud claim, and the original 1931 survey showing the full 31-acre Webb property. My grandfather assembled this before he died. My grandmother kept it." The pleasantness left Delaney's face. Not hostility. The man was too professional for hostility. But the careful pleasantness was gone, and what replaced it was the expression of a lawyer who has arrived at a situation believing he understood it and discovered that he does not. He looked at Marcus for a moment. Then he looked at Ranger, who was sitting absolutely still with his pale amber eyes on Delaney's face. Then he looked back at Marcus. "I'll need to relay this to my client," he said. "You do that." Delaney picked up his business card from the porch railing. A reflex, Marcus thought, the reflexive tidiness of a man who did not leave things behind, and walked back down the drive with somewhat less composure in his gait than he'd had coming up. Marcus watched until the Knoxville sedan pulled back onto the county road and moved south. Ranger made a sound, not the nameless sound from the smokehouse, but a short, far quiet exhale that Marcus had come to understand as his version of satisfaction. "Don't get comfortable," Marcus said. "We're not done." If this story has you hooked, and I think it has, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is told with everything I've got, and your support is the reason I keep making them. Thank you for being here. Earl Sutton came down along the creek path that afternoon with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil and an expression that suggested the casserole was partly a reason for visiting and partly a pretext for one. He set the dish on the kitchen table, now cleared of the documents, which Marcus had carefully photographed with his phone and placed back in the trunk in the order he'd found them, and looked around the farmhouse with the frank assessment of a man who had been in it before and was measuring the distance between then and now. "Vera used to make that cornbread dressing every fall," he said. "Ruth, my wife, figured it'd keep you from having to cook while you're getting settled. Thank her for me." Earl sat in the chair Marcus indicated without ceremony. Ranger came over and pressed his nose briefly against Earl's knee, a greeting, not a demand, and then returned to his position by the door. Earl watched the dog. "He does that in here too," Earl said. "Same way he did it at the Smokehouse." "He does it in this room specifically," Marcus said. "Not the whole house. This room." Earl looked at the floor, or then at the table, then at Marcus. "Vera spent a lot of time in this room," he said quietly. "Last few years especially." Marcus did not respond to this directly. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the camp pot and set one in front of Earl. "You said Roy was up here twice with a lawyer. The man in the suit, was it a lean guy, dark coat, drives a Knoxville plate?" "That's him." "Delaney. He was here this morning." Earl's hands wrapped around the coffee cup. He did not ask what was said, which Marcus noted as the courtesy of a man who understood what was and wasn't his business. After a moment, he said, "Roy's been telling people you won't be able to maintain the property, that you've got," he paused, choosing his words with some care, "problems that make it hard for you to hold a place together." "What kind of problems?" Earl met his eyes. "The kind people say about veterans when they want to discredit them, without saying anything specific enough to be called out for it." Marcus drank his coffee. "People in this county know Vera's story," Earl continued. "They know she kept this property for 60 years by herself after Emmett was gone. Nobody could ever say a word against her. But you're new to most of them, and new gives Roy something to work with." He set his cup down. "He's been working it." "How many people is he working it with?" "Enough that the feed store in town has opinions. The Baptist church has opinions. The county planning board, which is where the Bridger Creek access permit has to go, has opinions." He paused. "The planning board meeting is in 2 weeks, a week before your probate hearing." Marcus absorbed this. The planning board meeting was the part he hadn't known about. A permit for access across his property, even a permit application, even a public discussion of one, before the probate court had resolved the estate, would create a legal situation that Roy's lawyer could potentially exploit. Not successfully, not with the documents on Marcus's side, but enough to delay. And delay was its own form of damage to a man who was living in a farmhouse with no utilities and a 30-day window before the court weighed in. "I need to know about a woman named Luella Gaines," Marcus said. "She would have been in her 30s or 40s in 1947, a witness to something at the county records office." Earl went still. "You know the name," Marcus said. "For Luella Gaines," Earl said it slowly. "Luella passed 15 years ago, but her daughter is still here. Margaret Pruitt, up near the Gap." He looked at Marcus steadily. "What did Luella witness?" "She signed an affidavit in 1965, describing what she saw when the 1947 deed for the creek bottom acreage was filed. She was prepared to testify." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the cedar thicket, and Ranger's ears moved without the rest of him moving. "She was Vera's closest friend," Earl said, "for 60 years. I know. Vera never told anyone what was in that smokehouse, not in 60 years. She didn't have to," Marcus said. "She just had to keep it." Earl looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man rearranging the furniture of a room he thought he'd known the layout of. Then he looked at Ranger, who was sitting by the door, with his attention fixed on something outside that Marcus could not yet see. "There's something else," Earl said. He set both hands flat on the table. "The 1931 survey, the original one, before any of the disputed transfers. I know who did it. Not the surveyor. He's long gone. But the man who witnessed the Bounds walk. He's in a nursing home in Morristown. He's 91 years old, and he still has all his faculties. He paused. His name is Dillard Pugh. He was 20 years old in 1931, and he walked the Bounds with the surveyor because Thomas Webb asked him to. He's told the story more than once over the years. Nobody ever came to write it down officially. Marcus put his coffee cup down. He looked at Earl Sutton. Does he know the property? He knows every foot of it. Walked it himself. Would he talk to me? Earl's chin moved. He'd talk to Vera's grandson, he said. Yes. Ranger found it the next morning. Marcus had been in the barn, taking stock of what remained structurally sound and what needed to come down before it came down on its own, when he heard the bark, not the alarm bark, not the nameless smokehouse sound, but something in between, the sharp, specific announcement of a dog who has located a thing and is registering its location. Marcus came around the corner of the barn and saw Ranger at the east edge of the property, at the boundary line where the Webb land ended and the creek bottom land that had been taken in 1947 began. The dog was standing at a fence post, an old one, cedar, gone gray. The wire attached to it rusted to the diameter of a thread in places, and he was not looking at the post. He was looking past it, into the brush that lined the creek bank on the other side of the property boundary. Marcus walked to him. He stood where Ranger was standing and looked at what Ranger was looking at. Survey stakes, new ones, bright orange plastic, driven into the creek bank at intervals of roughly 50 feet, each one flagged with the orange ribbon that marked active survey work. Someone had been on the creek bottom land recently, within the last month, Marcus estimated, given the condition of the ground disturbance around each stake, and had staked boundaries. Not the boundary of the full 19 acres. A smaller rectangle, centered on the best section of the bank, and the section where the water ran clearest and the bank was highest, and the view back up toward the ridge was the kind of view that fishing lodges put on their websites. He counted 9 stakes visible from where he stood. There would be more, deeper in the brush. Bridger Creek Holdings had already commissioned a survey. They were moving. The permit application, the planning board meeting, the probate challenge. It was all of a piece, all moving on the same timeline, all predicated on the assumption that Marcus Webb had arrived at a dilapidated property with no resources, no knowledge, and no legal standing that a well-funded development company needed to take seriously. Ranger sat beside him and pressed his flank against Marcus's leg. "They don't know what's in the trunk," Marcus said quietly. The dog looked up at him. "Or nobody knows except us and Delaney doesn't know what he's dealing with yet." Marcus looked at the survey stakes. "Roy thinks he's contesting a will. He doesn't know his grandfather, and my grandfather, were in a 51-year-old dispute about 19 acres of creek bottom, and my grandfather won before he ever left for Vietnam." He paused. "He just didn't live to use it." He took out his phone and photographed each visible stake. Then he photographed the fence post, the fence line, and the boundary between the two properties as it existed on the ground. Then he called the Knoxville attorney, whose card was in his pocket. Not Delaney, but a second name he had found in the documents, would a woman named Patricia Hurst, who had taken over the firm from her father, Samuel, and whose name appeared on the firm's current website as managing partner. She answered on the third ring. He did not explain everything immediately. He said he was the grandson of Emmett Webb, that he had materials assembled by his grandfather related to a 1947 deed fraud in Harlan County, and that he needed to know if the Hearst firm still had any files from his grandfather's case. There was a pause on the line. "Emmett Webb," Patricia Hearst said. She said it the way people said a name they had not heard in a long time, but hadn't forgotten. "My father handled that case in 1967. Or started to." Another pause. "Mr. Webb, my father kept every file he ever opened. They're in storage. If your grandfather's case is in there, and I believe it is, I can have it pulled within the week." "I can be in Knoxville tomorrow," Marcus said. "I'll have what I can find ready." He drove to Morristown first. The nursing home was a low brick building on the south edge of town, surrounded by the particular stillness that settled around places where people lived out their last years with whatever dignity the institutional world could provide. A nurse walked him to a room at the end of the main corridor and left him at the door with the brief instruction that Dillard was having a good day. A Dillard Pugh was a small man who had gone entirely white and sat in a recliner by the window with a blanket across his knees and eyes that were the pale, sharp blue of a man whose mind was still at full strength, regardless of what the body around it had decided to do. He looked at Marcus for a long moment when Marcus introduced himself, and then he looked at Ranger, who had come with Marcus because Marcus had not left him in the truck in 2 years and was not going to start. "Webb," Dillard said. His voice was thin but not weak. "Thomas Webb's people. His great-grandson. Thomas was a good man." Dillard looked at the window. What they did to him was wrong. Everybody in the county knew it. Nobody said so out loud because Alderman was the county, and in those days, that was enough. He looked back at Marcus. "Well, I walked those bounds with Raymond Stills in 1931. I could walk them today if my legs worked. I know every stone and every watermark. Would you be willing to make a statement?" Dillard looked at him steadily. "How long has it been since anybody asked me that?" "As far as I can tell, nobody has." "No," Dillard said. "No, they haven't." He adjusted the blanket on his knees with careful hands. "I've been sitting here for 4 years thinking that particular story would die with me." He paused. "Vera came to see me before she got too sick to travel. She told me it wouldn't. She told me the boy would come." He looked at Marcus with the direct gaze of a man who had run out of patience for anything other than directness. "She meant you. She meant me." "Then yes," Dillard said. "I'll make a statement. So get your lawyer in here before something happens to me." Marcus almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He put his hand out and Dillard Pugh took it, a grip still firm, the grip of a man who had worked with his hands for 80 years, and held it for a moment before releasing it. Ranger pressed his nose gently against the old man's knee. Dillard looked down at the dog with an expression that was close to wonder. "That's something," he said quietly. "His name is Ranger. He knows something." "He usually does," Marcus said. The drive back from Morristown took 2 hours along roads that wound through the hills in the specific way that hill country roads wound, following terrain rather than defying it. Marcus drove in silence and let the landscape accumulate outside the window and thought about the shape of things as they now stood. And he had the documents. He had a witness, 91 years old and sharp, and the court would need to move fast to take his testimony before the question of his endurance became relevant. He had a Knoxville attorney whose father had already done the foundational legal work 57 years ago, and whose firm's involvement in the original case was itself a form of evidentiary continuity. He had a neighbor who knew the county and its people, and who had, Marcus was beginning to understand, been quietly watching this property for years on Vera Webb's behalf. What he did not yet have was the planning board situation addressed. If Bridger Creek Holdings received a permit to survey an access easement across his property before the probate court resolved the estate, the situation became considerably more complicated. 2 weeks was not enough time to get the fraud case fully before a court, but it might be enough time to file a challenge to the planning board proceeding, enough to pause it, to require the board to acknowledge that the ownership of the underlying land was in active dispute. He needed Patricia Hearst to tell him if that was possible. He would find out tomorrow. He pulled off the county road and up the drive and parked beside the farmhouse and sat for a moment in the truck. The property was quiet around him, the October stillness of a place where the season was changing, where the last of the leaves were coming off the cedars and the grass was going brown along the ridge. The smokehouse door stood open as he had left it. The farmhouse windows reflected the late afternoon sky. Ranger put his paw on Marcus's arm. "I know," Marcus said. He got out of the truck. Inside, he lit the lantern and sat at the kitchen table with the stack of letters he had not yet read and the documented case his grandfather had built across a decade and a half of careful work, and then left sealed in a tin box under a stone floor for the grandson he would never meet to find. He opened letter number 27. His grandfather was moving towards something in these letters. He could feel it building across the later ones, the way tension builds in the last miles before a destination. Emmett had known, by the time of these later letters, that his case was close to complete. He had most of what he needed. He had been one document short. He had not known where the original deed was. He had not known about Alderman's notation on it. But he had not known that the document itself contained its own confession. Marcus had found it in a tin box under a stone in a smokehouse. The dog who had been trained to find things no one else could find had brought him to the door. He thought about this while he read. He thought about the way things moved across generations, not vanishing, not disappearing, but waiting in the specific way that sealed things wait, holding what they held with the patience of objects that have no urgency of their own, that simply persist until someone arrives with the right hands and the right knowledge and the right animal beside him. He thought about his grandmother at this table, in this room, in this lantern light or something like it, holding the same letters he was holding now, and knowing that she could not use what was in them, and choosing instead to keep it, to hold the ground, to seal the smokehouse, and maintain the property, and wait with the particular faith of a woman who believed that what was right would eventually find its moment. He thought about Earl Sutton, who had watched this property for years without being asked to, who had clocked Roy's visits and Delaney's car and brought a casserole dish from his wife as a reason to sit at this table and give Marcus what he needed to know. He thought about Dillard Pugh in his nursing home room, sitting by his window for 4 years, with a story that no one had come to write down, and his grandmother's visit before she got too sick to travel, and the promise she had apparently made him. The boy will come. The lantern threw its gold light across the kitchen. Ranger was asleep at Marcus's feet, twitching slightly in some dog dream that involved a great deal of focused running. Marcus watched him for a moment, the rise and fall of the dog's ribs, the small movements of his paws, the tilt of his ears even in sleep, and felt something that he had not had a name for in a long time, and that he was not going to try to name now, because some things were better held quietly. He turned back to letter 27. Outside, the county road lay empty in the last light. The smokehouse stood with its door open and its shelf clear, and its stone floor with the flat rock back in place over the empty tin. The evidence gone, the hiding place no longer needed. The thing it had held for 50 years, finally where it was supposed to be. In 3 weeks, the probate court would meet. In 2 weeks, the planning board would meet. Tomorrow, Marcus would drive to Knoxville and sit across from Patricia Hearst, and they would open the files her father had kept from 1967, and she would see what Marcus had, and he would see what the firm had, and together they would begin to understand what Emmett Webb had been reaching for across the length of a war he did not survive. The night settled over the ridge. The property breathed in the dark. And Marcus Webb, who had come home to a farmhouse he had never lived in, but had always, in some way he couldn't have explained, belonged to, sat at the table his grandmother had left him and read his grandfather's words by lantern light, while his dog slept at his feet, and the work of 2 generations waited, finally, to be finished. Patricia Hearst did not say much when Marcus set the original deed on her conference table in Knoxville. She read Alderman's notation twice. T. Webb did not sign. C.A. October 14th, 47. And then she set the document down and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The kind of silence that precedes something important. "My father spent 2 years on this case," she finally said. "When your grandfather died, there was nothing left to do with it. No client, no standing. He kept the files anyway." She looked at Marcus. "He told me once that some cases didn't close. They waited. This one waited 51 years. Yes." She picked up the deed carefully and held it toward the light from the window. "This is enough. This is more than enough." She set it down. "We file a fraud claim against the 1947 transfer. We attach Dillard Pugh's testimony, and we go before the planning board with a temporary injunction blocking any permit proceedings until the underlying ownership question is resolved. Roy's probate challenge collapses the moment the court sees this document. He cannot contest a will that pertains to land his own co-investor was fraudulently attempting to access. How long? The injunction can be filed this week. The planning board meets in 11 days. They'll have to table the Bridger Creek application. The probate hearing is in 18 days. We'll be ready." She looked at him steadily across the table. "Your grandfather built a complete case, Mr. Webb. He just never got to use it." "My grandmother kept it." "Your grandmother kept it," she agreed. The planning board meeting ran 40 minutes. Delaney was there, composed, as always, but operating now with the measured care of a man who understood the ground had shifted under him. Patricia Hearst presented the injunction filing and the underlying documentation with the efficient precision of someone who had spent a career in rooms like this one. The board chair, a heavy-set man named Garland, who had the look of someone accustomed to things proceeding as expected, read the summary twice, and then looked at Delaney, and then looked back at the papers. He tabled the application without discussion. Roy was not in the room. He had sent Delaney in his place, and Delaney accepted the tabling without argument, which told Marcus everything he needed to know about what Roy had been told after Delaney's report from the farmhouse drive. Earl Sutton was in the back row. He said nothing during the meeting. On the way out, he fell into step beside Marcus on the sidewalk, and they walked half a block before either of them spoke. "Garland's going to have to explain this to some people," Earl said. "He'll manage." Roy's going to be quiet for a while. He will. Earl stopped walking. He put out his hand, and Marcus shook it, and Earl held the grip for a moment, with the particular weight of a man saying something that did not require words. Ranger walked between them, looking up at each of their faces in turn. The probate court met on a Thursday morning in November, 17 days after Marcus had arrived at the farmhouse, with a truck full of what he owned, and no clear plan beyond standing on ground. That was his. Patricia Hearst presented, and the judge, a woman named Alcott, who read every document she was given with the thorough attention that suggested she had been doing this long enough to know that the documents were always where the truth actually lived, asked 3 questions, and then called a 15-minute recess, and came back and ruled the will as filed valid in its entirety. The estate to pass to Marcus Allen Webb per its terms, including all outbuildings and their contents, all acreage described in the original 1931 survey, and the 19 acres of creek bottom land to be restored to the Webb estate, pending the resolution of the fraud claim against the 1947 transfer, which she described in her ruling as supported by compelling and unambiguous evidence. Roy did not contest it. Delaney filed a single response, 2 paragraphs, that read like a document prepared by a man who already knew its outcome. Bridger Creek Holdings withdrew their permit application 6 days later. Marcus drove back to the farmhouse in the early afternoon light of a November day that was clear and cold, and the particular shade of blue that the Tennessee sky turned in the weeks before winter arrived. Ranger rode with his nose to the cracked window, reading the air, tracking whatever dogs tracked in the smell of moving countryside. When they came off the county road and up the drive, the farmhouse stood in the thin sunlight with its cracked windows and its sagging porch boards and its chimney leaning slightly east. And it looked, for the first time since Marcus had arrived, not like a structure in need of work, but like a home in the early stages of being reclaimed. He sat in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine. 19 acres of creek bottom, the farmhouse, the barn, the smokehouse with its empty shelf and its open door and its earthen floor where a tin box had waited under a stone since 1973. All of it his. All of it always his, waiting with the patience of things that belong somewhere for the person they belong to arrive. His grandfather had built the case. His grandmother had kept it. Ranger had brought him to the door. He got out of the truck and stood in the cold air with his hand resting on the dog's neck, looking out across the property toward the creek bottom land where the survey stakes would need to come out. He would do it himself this week, one by one, and feeling the specific weight of a thing finally resolved, settling into him the way warmth settles into cold stone. Not loudly, not all at once, just steadily, and for good. "All right," he said. Ranger pressed against his leg and looked up at him with those pale amber eyes, and then looked out across the land. And they stood there together in the November light. 2 veterans, both of them marked by what they had carried, neither of them broken by it. On ground that was finally, undeniably, theirs. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than I can say. If this story moved you, the videos on your screen right now were chosen because I think you'll feel the same way about them. Go watch one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I'll see you in the next story.